Good day. In my program yesterday, at the end of my program yesterday, I said that it was my intention in this program to return to the situation in the Middle East, but in the event I'm not going to do so, because whilst there are important developments in the Middle East, the situation there has not yet developed to fruition, whereas the situation in Ukraine and on the Ukrainian battlefronts is becoming dramatic and, in my opinion, requires urgent discussion. I would say also that President Putin has given a follow-up interview to the interview he gave to Tucker Carlson. This is an interview he gave to a Russian journalist, Pavel Zarubin, who regularly interviews him. Putin was clearly unhappy with parts of the interview with Tucker Carlson. He makes it clear that he found Carlson a cunning and, as he says, a dangerous interviewer, and that the interview was not at all as he had anticipated, and he wanted to say more and explain himself further in very interesting ways, and he's done so in this interview with Pavel Zarubin. It's a long interview, and in order to do it proper justice, I'm going to discuss it tomorrow. One thing I would quickly add is that it is quite clear that Putin was very, very impressed with Tucker Carlson, and his comments about Tucker Carlson should in no sense be considered criticisms. Rather, they are Putin himself acknowledging that he was up against an extremely intelligent and very skilled interviewer who conducted the interview in a way that Putin himself had not anticipated. But I'm going to now turn to the situation in Ukraine, where events are becoming dramatic. And the first thing to say is that the Russians have very elliptically now confirmed that they have encircled some Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka. Again, it's striking how Russian officials are careful not to mention Avdiivka or to identify the place where this is happening. But anyway, this is the report which has appeared in TASS, published by the TASS, the official Russian news agency TASS, this morning. And it says the following: a part of the Ukrainian battle group near Donetsk has been encircled by Russian troops. Advisor to the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Igor Kimakovsky, told TASS on Thursday, in other words, early this morning. The battle group of the Ukrainian armed forces has been cut off near Donetsk, and part of it is under intense gunfire control and is actually encircled. The Ukrainian military is attempting to leave some positions and is sustaining casualties, he added. And that is the entirety of the report from TASS. Notice that there is no mention of Avdiivka by name. We're simply told that all of this is happening near Donetsk, which of course gives it away because Avdiivka is very close to Donetsk. It can perhaps be understood as an industrial, part residential suburb of Donetsk, and that's why the report clearly refers to what is taking place in Avdiivka itself. Anyway, that is from the Russians this morning. Now, yesterday we had a comment from the Ukrainian military, and this comment came from the head an official of the Tavria Operational and Strategic Group of Forces, Dmytro Likhovi. Now, the Tavria Operational Strategic Group of Forces is commanded by General Tarnavsky. Interestingly and importantly, he did not make this statement. It was made on his behalf by Dmytro Likhovi, and I'm going to read it in full. It says the following: the enemy has amassed about 50,000 troops in the Avdiivka sector. If the enemy cuts off logistics supply routes to Avdiivka, the Defense Forces Command has provided for backup lines. Dmytro Likhovi, the head of communications of the communications department of the Tavria Operational and Strategic Group of Troops, said this on Ukrainian television when asked about the threat of cutting off supply routes in the Avdiivka sector. Ukrinform reports, our approach is that we do not comment on the events in Avdiivka in real time because it is not a football match, and for reasons of safety of deploying units, we cannot talk about the specific locations of positions and troops. As of now, the situation on the front line is dynamic and can change literally every hour. Our troops are making every effort to hold their positions in case the main logistics line is cut off by the enemy. Our command has provided for backup supply routes, said Likhovi. He added that fighting has been going on inside Avdiivka for several days now, which is causing a change in the tactics of the defense forces. The situation is flexible and dynamic. The enemy is using armored groups in the north and south of Avdiivka. On some days, the enemy is using small assault groups. The day before, the enemy deployed small infantry assault groups in one section of the contact line, but they consisted of 5 to 6 brigades at once. This is an indication of the fighting, the spokesman noted. In total, the enemy has amassed about 50,000 troops in the Avdiivka sector, said Likhovi. He noted that the defense forces are fighting for every piece of their homeland, while the priority is to save soldiers' lives. At a time when the situation on the battlefield is becoming the most difficult, the main thing is to save the lives of soldiers and take them to another position, to act flexibly, to maneuver in order to save troops for the next fighting, to recapture the territory that may have been lost. As for Avdiivka, I can say that the events of the last few days, particularly the enemy's artillery and rocket attacks on the settlements of the Donetsk region's Pokrovsk district, which are located a little to the west of Avdiivka, show that each of these settlements and villages can turn into after the front line moves a little further west. And that is a most interesting statement, and I'm going to say straight away that it is, in effect, as far as I can see, an admission that the main supply line into Avdiivka has already been cut, and that the Ukrainians are now trying to find ways to extract their troops from Avdiivka. Note what he says, that as of now, the situation on the front line is dynamic and can literally change every hour, which is, in effect, an admission that the Ukrainians are being forced to retreat. He talks about how the enemy, meaning the Russians, are using armored groups in the north and south of Avdiivka, an admission of the existence of the two pincers. The one the Russians have established in the south, just north of the Tsar's hunting lodge fortification. The other, much more powerful and dangerous grouping that has smashed into Avdiivka from the northeast and has now captured large areas in the central parts of Avdiivka, and as we will see shortly, has in fact cut the main supply road. Note also that he says that that Russians have deployed armored units in the north and south, and that the fighting in Avdiivka has been going on for several days. And lastly, note also how he says that even if the main supply line is cut off, which is in effect, as I said, an admission, an attempt to prepare the Ukrainian public for the fact that the main supply line has indeed been cut off, that the Ukrainian command is going to try to establish backup supply lines, though of course it's problematic, very difficult to see how that can be done. Now, yesterday, a report appeared from a Russian war reporter. He said that the Russians were preparing to give a ultimatum to the Ukrainian forces that they needed to capitulate, to lay down their arms or face complete encirclement. Now, I've not heard any formal confirmation that such an ultimatum has indeed been given. Some people think that an ultimatum of that kind has indeed been given, and that the Russians have, or that the Ukrainians have rejected it. But as I said, for the moment, it's, not confirmed from the Russians, but the very fact that people are talking about an ultimatum at all, well, that does indeed point to a dire situation for the Ukrainians. And of course, we've since then had this report from TASS that Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka, and it can only be Avdiivka, are now surrounded. And lastly, going back to Likhovy's statement, which the Ukrainians have now published, note what he says about Russian missile attacks in areas close to Avdiivka. I can say that the events of the last few days, particularly the enemy's artillery and rocket attacks on the settlements of the Donetsk region's Pokrovsk district, which are located a little west of Avdiivka, show that each of these settlements and villages can turn into, after the front line moves a little further west. That's a very interesting statement. It appears to allude to the Russian missile strike on Selidovo that I spoke about yesterday. We've had a cascade of comments about that attack, mainly from Ukrainian sources, all of which appear to confirm the missile strike on Selidovo, on the training base in Selidovo. And it does look as if a devastating strike on Selidovo did take place. The Russian Defense Ministry has not yet confirmed it. I said in my program yesterday that I would wait until the weekend to see what the Russian Defense Ministry would say about it. But then it occurred to me that the Russian Defense Ministry is not saying anything about developments in the Battle of Avdiivka. And to the extent that the missile strike on Selidovo must be seen in the context of the fighting in Avdiivka, it may be that it is covered by the same policy of silence that the Russian Defense Ministry is giving to the situation in Avdiivka altogether. So, just saying, we have elliptical confirmation now that this missile strike on Selidovo did take place, and it comes from Lychowy, in other words, from the Ukrainians. But there is something else in this comment, because he says that the missile strikes, and of course we know that there was more than one, Selidovo was not the only place which was the target of Russian missile, artillery and rocket attacks, as he puts it. He says that the missile strikes, these strikes, show what each of these settlements and villages can turn into after the front line moves a little further west. That is an admission that Avdiivka is about to fall after the front line moves a little further west. It can only mean that the front line is soon going to reach these villages, and that can only happen once Avdiivka falls, and it looks as if the fall of Avdiivka is now conceded even by the coming fall. The pending fall of Avdiivka is being acknowledged by the Ukrainians themselves, though of course they're doing so in this extremely elliptical way. I'm going to suggest that Lychowy's statement, which as I said is clearly intended to manage and prepare the Ukrainian public for the collapse of Avdiivka and the fact that a large number of Ukrainian troops is in effect cut off there, that Lychowy's statement has been extremely carefully prepared by the Ukrainian authorities, and the fact that it has been made by Lychowy rather than by any more senior official, General Tarnavsky, General Syrski, someone from Zelensky's office, is a sign also that the top people in Ukraine are now trying to distance themselves from what is clearly becoming an evolving disaster. Anyway, that's statements from the Russians, from Lychowy, and I'm going to finish with one very last statement, which comes, interestingly, from the 3rd Assault Brigade, which is, of course, the Azov Brigade, which we are told is being rushed, well, it isn't being told, which is being rushed to the Avdiivka area in order to try to stabilize the situation. And I should say that I'm getting this information from Redovka, which is, of course, a Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, very supportive of the Russian military in the war and of the special military operation in aggregate, but they say that it comes from the 3rd Assault Brigade, in other words, from the Azov Brigade's own Telegram channel. It says that they consider that the current situation in Avdiivka is hell. The situation in the combat zone is Avdiivka's hell. The situation in the city at the time of the establishment of the brigade is extremely critical. The brigade has to fight 360 degrees, which suggests that it is encircled. The unit added that the objective situation in Avdiivka is threatening and unstable. In other words, we have an effective admission. Again, from the 3rd Assault Brigade, the troops who were rushed to Avdiivka, that they have in effect been surrounded. So, these are reports from officials, from official sources, from the Russians, appearing in the TASS news agency, from the Ukrainians themselves, the statement from Lychovy. We also have this statement from the 3rd Assault Brigade. It's, as I said, come to me at second hand from Redovka, but I don't have any doubt that it is accurate. Now, it is also backed by a cascade of reports from the situation in Avdiivka itself. Now, I've spoken over the last couple of days about how it seemed to me that the Ukrainian units holed up in the air defense base and the Cheburasha complex had in effect been encircled by the Russians. There were more reports about this earlier this morning. It seems that the Russians are now in occupation of all the roads leading to these two positions, that the remaining gap that the Ukrainian troops in these positions could use to try to escape is now just 700 meters wide. That can be covered by machine gun fire, not to mention mortars and anti-tank weapons and all of those sorts of things. And importantly, of course, it would be through open fields and perhaps some woodlands. So these troops are in effect encircled. It is likely that the Russians will plug this 700-meter gap at some point within the next few hours, at which point these troops in the air defense base and the Cheburasha complex will not just be encircled, they will be trapped. And there are also reports that in another one of these outlying places to the east of Avdiivka, or perhaps two of them, Ukrainian troops are also now at risk of becoming trapped and cut off from the main body of Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka itself. Now, I'm going to make a comment here. I find this absolutely astonishing, completely incomprehensible that the Ukrainian command can have allowed this situation to develop. It was clear once the Russians captured the Tsar's hunting lodge and consolidated their positions in the southern districts of Avdiivka, that the troops in the Ukrainian troops in the remaining part of the air defense base, still under Ukrainian control, and the Cheburasha complex, were at imminent risk of being cut off and surrounded. I would have thought that any rational commander looking at this situation would have understood that and would have ordered the immediate withdrawal of these troops. I cannot for the life of me see what the military logic of keeping those troops there actually was. It's important to say that the Ukrainians, by every account, are outnumbered in the Avdiivka area, and we've been hearing report after report after report about how short of manpower the Ukrainian military is. So throwing away, sacrificing these soldiers by allowing them to become trapped in places like the air defense base, the Cheburasha complex, and other fortified positions to the east of Avdiivka is incomprehensible. And it suggests major flaws to me in the Ukrainian command. Now, I say all of this, as I said, I have to add the caveat that I'm not a military person, not by any stretch of the imagination. But, well, it seems to me, in this case, the facts speak for themselves. These troops were in isolated positions, at risk of being cut off from Avdiivka itself. The logical thing to do was to pull them back. They weren't pulled back. They're now at risk, in some cases, of being surrounded and trapped. The troops in the air defense complex and the Cheburasha complex are now surrounded and, in effect, trapped. What was the sense of all of this? I simply cannot see it. And it does beg important questions, as I said, about the way in which Ukrainian troops are being commanded in this battle. I do not know who the overall commander in charge of the defense of Avdiivka is, but it seems to me that whoever he has acted with astonishing negligence in this matter. I'm going to speculate that there is, in fact, more than one person involved. I've discussed in recent programs how chaotic the Ukrainian command structure appears to have become, and it's clear that for some of the time, the person who was in overall charge of the defense of Avdiivka nominally was the commander of the 110th Brigade, but it's clear that all sorts of other people, General Tarnavsky, the commander of the Tavria group, who's still in post, General Zelensky, who has now been sacked, President Zelensky himself, no doubt General Syrski in the last couple of days after he replaced General Zelensky. Anyway, it seems to me that all of them have been making contradictory decisions about what to do in Avdiivka. It's quite likely that they don't have a clear sense of the overall picture, or they didn't until perhaps yesterday, and all sorts of chaotic and misconceived decisions were being made in consequence. One of those misconceived decisions was the bizarre decision to deploy the 3rd Assault Brigade in Avdiivka itself. There was speculation from people like Dima at the Military Summary Channel that they would instead try and attack on the flanks towards Krasnogorovka, somehow folding the Russian forces around Avdiivka, creating a trap for them. I always thought this was a wildly over-ambitious operation for the Ukrainian forces at this time, but at least trying it would have given the 3rd Assault Brigade and other units a way out, a secure line of retreat. Instead, they appear to have been deployed in Avdiivka itself, and if Radovka is to be believed, their own telegram channel says that they are now in effect surrounded, that they have to fight 360 degrees. So we see incompetent, chaotic, ill-informed decisions in order to try to defend Avdiivka, which, far from assisting in the defense of Avdiivka, are making the situation in Avdiivka much worse. And if we come back now to the situation in Avdiivka itself, well, it's not just that these outlying areas with the troops, the Ukrainian troops in these places, are now being cut off. But it's clear, as I said, that the main body of Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka, caught between the pincers of the Russian advance on the north and the Russian advance in the south, that they are cut off as well. And there's been lots of discussion, lots of argument about whether the Russians had indeed captured parts of the main supply road. There was some debate and discussion about whether the Russians had captured 2 gas stations which lay somewhere to the west of that main supply road. I think we can now say with reasonable certainty not only that the Russians have done so, but the very latest reports suggest that the Russians are advancing well past the main supply road, that they're consolidating and driving further west still towards one of the villages that lie actually west of Avdiivka. And that means that not only the main supply road is cut off, but the other small country roads, small country lanes, are now at risk of being cut by the Russians as well. And lastly, the Russian reporter who yesterday was talking about an ultimatum being given to the Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka to surrender, well, he's also said that the Ukrainians have been warned that a major tank offensive is being in preparation by the Russians, that the Russians intend to advance from their positions to the southwest of Avdiivka, and that they will also be advancing with armoured vehicles, with tanks, towards Avdiivka itself. Apparently the Russians are confident that the Ukrainians will not be able to withstand these advances. And of course, if this advance does take place, it's a little strange that the Russians would inform the Ukrainians about it in advance, but who knows, maybe the situation is now so dire for the Ukrainians that the Russians feel that they can give this information. Anyway, if this advance takes place, and assuming it is successful, then of course the situation in Avdiivka will not just be catastrophic, as to all appearances it already is, it will become terminal. Now, all of this is happening alongside continued massive bombing by the Russian Air Force of Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka. And we're now having lots of film of this. The 9th quarter, the place of the high rises, the area also sometimes referred to as Khimik, is now being extremely heavily bombed by the Russians. We can see constant explosions of these massive Russian bombs, 500 kilo and 1,500 kilo bombs. Ukrainian positions are being bombed right across Avdiivka, as far as I can see. But primarily and principally, it seems that the focus of the bombing is this 9th quarter. We're told that Russian bomb strikes can involve as many as 30 bombs at any particular moment in time. And the effect, again, on the Ukrainian defenses must be devastating. And the Russians are also bombing and carrying out airstrikes and artillery strikes on all the roads leading into Avdiivka, north of the Russian positions where the roads have been cut off, and they also seem to be shelling and bombing the country lanes. And there's pictures now that have appeared of these roads. It seems that there is some kind of thaw underway in Ukraine at the present time. The result is that the roads appear to be almost almost like they look like almost like bogs. They become muddy, which is also severely restricting Ukraine's ability to move troops either to or from Avdiivka using these roads, not to mention the fact that the roads are being bombed as well. Lastly, yesterday, Dima on the Military Summary Channel published a film, apparently a contemporary film, I'm not sure how it's made, showing Ukrainian troops in this ninth quarter, the Chimik area, the citadel, as it's sometimes also called, the area of the high rises. It looks absolutely devastated. The buildings are now shells, but they're moving around, and Dima made the absolutely correct point that they're moving at a snail's pace, exercising extraordinary caution. Dima speculated that it could be that they're worried that the Russians have already infiltrated this part of Avdiivka and that Russian snipers might be operating from some of the buildings. I personally think what is much more likely is that the Ukrainian troops are worried about the presence of Russian surveillance drones and, of course, about the possible use by the Russians of FPV drones to attack them. We are still getting no footage of FPV drone strikes from the Ukrainians. It is now several days, perhaps a week, since the Ukrainians published pictures of FPV drone strikes in the Avdiivka area. It could be because the Russians are now successfully jamming these drones. I believe, to a great extent, that that is the case. And it could also be that the situation is now so bad that the Ukrainians are not prepared to publish the footage of such drone strikes as they're able to carry out, because that would reveal the catastrophic situation and the extent to which the Russians have advanced within Avdiivka itself. So I've given a comprehensive picture of what the situation in Avdiivka is like. Early this morning, there were reports that Ukrainian troops are now surrendering en masse in parts of Avdiivka. There was a report that 50 Ukrainian troops had surrendered, giving up their positions, and of course the report from TASS, from Igor Kimakovsky, the advisor to Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, he said that the Ukrainian military is attempting to leave some positions and is sustaining casualties. And some people, Dima at the Military Summary Channel, is suggesting that in some places, especially in the southern areas of Avdiivka, the Russians are able to occupy territory unopposed, perhaps because the Ukrainian troops who were charged with defending that territory have chosen to surrender, or I would say conceivably because the Ukrainians are trying to retreat from it. So altogether, a catastrophic situation in Avdiivka. Now, yesterday, we were also getting reports that an emergency meeting of President Zelensky and his top military commanders had been convened in Kiev. Now, it's completely unclear what decisions were made at this meeting, but there are some reports, and one must be very cautious here because the reports appear to be coming second-hand from Russian sources, and one wonders how they would get information about what took place in a top meeting in Kiev. But anyway, these reports speak of a very bad meeting, of a huge row, of some people, perhaps the military, trying to get the political leaders to understand how bad the situation in Avdiivka has become, perhaps trying to get the political leaders to agree to a full-scale retreat and abandonment from Avdiivka, and the politicians, Zelensky and his advisors, perhaps resisting that advice. Now, this is very speculative, but something also happened today which was very strange, but which suggests that the politicians, for the moment, are still, despite the rapidly deteriorating situation, unwilling to countenance a withdrawal from Avdiivka. And that is that, bizarrely, even as Avdiivka collapses, the defense of Avdiivka collapses, even as Ukrainian troops are, according to both Russian and Ukrainian reports, now encircled, the Ukrainian authorities have embarked on a project of renaming streets in Avdiivka. The streets in Avdiivka still carry Soviet names. I'm not going to recite what they are, but I noticed that one street is named after the Soviet politician Sergei Kirov, another is named after the Soviet politician Clemente Voroshilov. Well, it seems that all of these names are being changed, and that they're being given Ukrainian names in place of the Russian names. And this, on the face of it, seems incredibly strange. And I can't help but think that it's a way for the politicians to convey to the military that they are not prepared to retreat from Avdiivka, that this is a Ukrainian town, that Ukraine must retain control of Avdiivka, and that giving the streets Ukrainian names is somehow symbolic of that. It could also be that some of the people in Zelensky's team, and possibly Zelensky himself, think that over the next couple of days there will be lots of communiques and reports from Avdiivka about the fighting in Avdiivka, and they don't want these reports to reference Russian names, Soviet names of streets where street fighting is taking place. They want instead the reports to use Ukrainian names. Whatever the logic, it is a bizarre decision. One would have thought that at this time it is the least priority. But that appears to be the decision which has been made, and I can't help but think that it must have come at this odd time from somebody senior in Kiev for it to have been announced in the way that it has. So, a catastrophic situation, troops being cut off, troops being encircled, the 3rd Assault Brigade, the Azov Brigade, surrounded for the second time in the war. They were surrounded in Mariupol, and it looks like they're being surrounded again in Avdiivka. And, well, it is impossible to see what the Ukrainians can do to reverse this situation. It is probably still possible to withdraw at least some troops from Avdiivka. How many is problematic, and the losses by now would presumably be extremely high. But it seems that the decision to withdraw is not being made, in which case there will come a point, as it did in Mariupol, when a further retreat is simply impossible. I do wonder what the military people are making of the situation, what they're saying to each other about what they must feel is increasingly deluded and decision making being made by the Ukrainian leadership, which is now becoming increasingly disconnected from reality. Now, saying all of that, there is perhaps some kind of reasoning behind this decision to hold on to Avdiivka. The same sort of reasoning that I remember Ukrainian officials coming up with when the defense of Mariupol took place, which is that it was important to defend Mariupol for as long as possible so that stronger defense lines could be created further west, and it could be that the same thinking is being used to explain the decision now. There are reports that I've seen that the Ukrainians are now trying to create, or rather that the political leaders are trying to create, a defense line somewhat further to the west of Mariupol, beginning in the town of Pakrovsk, continuing to Kurachovo, a little to the south, and, well, further north as well. Simplicius the thinker has a map which shows the yellow line where this, along which this presumed defense line would be. And General Syrski, who has up to now had a reputation for being a commander who always likes to go on the offensive. Anyway, his interview, which I discussed briefly yesterday, I've now seen more of that interview and I've taken further note of what he's saying. And importantly, General Syrski is also talking about Ukraine's need now to go entirely onto the defensive. And it could be that this line, this yellow line that Simplicius the thinker has drawn, is indeed the defense line that the Ukrainians are thinking of establishing. I'm going to say straight away that this looks to me as delusional as the decision to hold on to Avdiivka itself. There simply isn't the time to create proper defenses along a line like this. Ukrainian units, men of the 47th Brigade, have already been complaining that there are no fortified lines of any significance west of Avdiivka. The idea that these can be created in advance of what is increasingly looking like an overwhelming Russian offensive seems to me completely surreal. And I also have to say that looking at the line itself, it simply doesn't have the density or the depth that the earlier Zelensky line, the one that the Ukrainians have been defending since the summer of 2022, previously had. It would be an improvised defense line, lacking strategic depth, or so it seems to me. Again, I say that always with the caveat that I am not a military person. But somebody who is a military person has now sent a personal email to me, a private email to me, And again, I have to be very careful not to disclose the identity of this person. All I would say is that he is a Westerner, he's not a Ukrainian, and he does have a military background. And he makes the point that Zelensky, in a sense, is right. I mean, the right thing for the Ukrainians to do, unquestionably, in this situation, is to go on the defensive. George Beebe and Jim Webb were saying the same thing way back in August, whilst Ukraine was trying to conduct its famous offensive. The right thing to do is to forget about offensives, try to go on the defensive, try to build fortified lines to the extent that you can, try to hold the Russians back, and like Jim Webb, this person says that going on the defensive is the right thing to do, but it must be coupled with a political strategy. And that means negotiating with the Russians, something which, of course, the Ukrainians flat out refuse to do. Well, the problem is, and this person, I have to be very careful now because he doesn't exactly say this, and I am perhaps reading things into his email, but I've read the email and I think I'm not misrepresenting this position, his position. What this person thinks is that the only viable defense line is not where this yellow line that we see on Simplicius the Thinker's map is drawn. I say that, as I say, he doesn't actually mention this yellow line, but he is talking about a defense line along the Dnieper. And that seems to me logical. There simply isn't the strategic depth. There simply isn't the time to establish fortified lines east of the Dnieper. What the Ukrainians need to do is to conduct, as this person put it, a fighting retreat, slowing the Russians down as much as they can and pulling back behind the Dnieper. The Russians have made it easy for them. Even now, they haven't attacked the Dnieper bridges. And perhaps if the Ukrainians move whatever air defense assets they still have, they can cover the Dnieper bridges and organize a retreat across the Dnieper. And the Dnieper would be a strong fortified barrier. It would be a challenge for the Russians to cross. In time, the Russians would be able to cross the Dnieper if the Ukrainians did not come to terms, but it would not be a straightforward operation, and retreating beyond the Dnieper would buy the Ukrainians time. This person also said that the Ukrainians need to fortify their positions in the north to counter the possibility of a Russian advance from the north. And again, I may be reading more into what he said and than he means, but I took him to mean a possible advance from the north towards Kiev rather than to places like Kharkiv, east of the Dnieper, which logically is becoming increasingly undefendable and which perhaps the Ukrainians need to start thinking about abandoning. But even this person concedes that this would only buy Ukraine a limited amount of time, and it needs to negotiate if it is to survive. Now, all of this seems to me to make complete sense, but there is no sign that it is what the Ukrainians are going to do. All the indications are that they're going to try to hold on as long as they can east of the Dnieper, opening themselves up to further disasters and the eventual destruction of the best part of their army as the Russians are able to destroy it piecemeal in the fighting east of the Dnieper. I have found it very difficult for a very long time, indeed pretty much from the moment when the Istanbul negotiations collapsed, to understand Ukrainian thinking. But it seems to me that one disastrous mistake has been made after another. A disastrous mistake to launch those offensives in the autumn in Kharkiv and Kherson region, which did achieve significant territorial gains and did embarrass the Russians considerably, but which also caused the Ukrainians to suffer losses they could not afford. Brian Beletic has discussed this at length. The even more disastrous decision taken by the Ukrainians in the winter and spring of 2023 to defend Bakhmut, far beyond the point where it became certain that Bakhmut would be lost, and then to try to counterattack in order to try to recapture it. The absolutely catastrophic decision, backed, it must be said, by Western governments and Western militaries, to launch that disastrously ill-conceived offensive in the summer. Alex and I at the Duran and on this channel said that we thought this was massively ill-conceived. Brian Beletic at New Atlas said it was misconceived. Well, perhaps we're not the most authoritative military people. But someone like Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, for example, who knows far more about war than we do, and who has commanded men in battle, he also said, he was also warning that this offensive in the summer was impossibly high risk and very likely to go disastrously wrong. And he was right. You only have to go to his channel and you can follow what he says there. And if you can go back and read all the many things that he wrote about this in places like 45, and you'll see it was all laid out there by Daniel Davis. He said repeatedly, this has all the makings of a potential disaster. And so it turned out. And then there was this equally strange decision to try to advance towards Crimea across the Dnieper River, leading to the creation of the Krinky bridgehead. The best comment about that was made by Brian Beletic, a repeat, as he put it, of the summer counteroffensive, another advance against essentially impregnable Russian fortifications, but one in which you place a huge river, the Dnieper, in precisely the area where you need to establish your supply lines. I mean, it made absolutely no sense at all. And now, of course, capping all of that, we have this unfolding disaster in Avdiivka. Well, I'm not going to say more. I'm not going to try to understand the very eccentric decision-making, disastrously eccentric decision-making being made in Kiev. What I will say is this. I noticed that President Zelensky is now preparing to go on another trip to Europe. It is often the case that when the situation becomes particularly bad, particularly in Kiev itself, Zelensky packs his bags and leaves Kiev and goes abroad. Often these visits that he does have no discernible purpose behind them. But of course, their actual purpose is to get Zelensky out of Kiev. And I can't help but think that that is the purpose of this particular visit. It seems that General Zelensky, who is now sacked, is now joining President Poroshenko's party. It looks as if, in other words, his political opponents in Kiev, who increasingly center on the former president, Petro Poroshenko, are gathering. If the Azov Brigade is going to be cut off again in Avdiivka, and heavens help us, is forced into a ignominious surrender a second time, that will make the nationalists in Ukraine furious with Zelensky, and by the way also with Syrskyi, and Zelensky is there potentially in a position to provide them with a leader. So situation for Zelensky in Kiev might be becoming increasingly threatening. And of course, one can't help but wonder whether the military people, even people like General Syrskyi, aren't relieved in some ways to see him go. Because to the extent that Zelensky is responsible for these eccentric decisions, well, having him leave Kiev might be something of a relief, because it might mean that for a while they're able to take decisions by themselves without Zelensky's constant meddling and interference. Just to get a sense, by the way, of how utterly bizarre the situation in Kiev has become, I have to touch on a really extraordinary story which is now circulating in the French media. I haven't seen the first-hand reports myself. I'm relying purely on second-hand reports. I find this so extraordinary that I'm not sure to what extent to believe in it. But anyway, the story runs like this, that President Macron was intending to travel to Kiev to meet President Zelensky there. The purpose of this visit would have been the same as the recent visit by Prime Minister Sunak to Kiev, and I think the German Chancellor was also in Kiev to sign some kind of irrelevant security pact with Ukraine. But President Macron abruptly called this visit off because of what he said was the deteriorating military situation. The deteriorating, not military situation, security situation. And the story that is apparently circulating in the French media is that the deteriorating security situation amounted to a scheme by Kirilo Budanov, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, to assassinate President Macron whilst he was in Kiev, and to blame the assassination on the Russians. Now, I have to say, this seems completely crazy to me. I mean, it's so way off crazy that, my mind reels at the thought of it, which makes me wonder whether this can possibly be true. But I will say, if there is any person in a position of authority on planet Earth at this time who might just be capable of coming up with a crazy scheme like this, that person would indeed be Kirill Budanov. Now, all I will say is that if this is true, then I have to say I think even Western governments are going to have to conclude that Budanov is short of a few screws, as we say in the West, and needs therefore to be, well, retired from his position as head of Ukrainian military intelligence. But, well, who knows? We'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, the whole thing is completely bizarre. And as I said, the very fact that this story is circulating at all gives us some insight into how fevered the situation in Kiev has now become. Even if this is, in fact, a Russian disinformation exercise, which it might be, the very fact that this story is being spread and is gaining some traction, also, in spite of that, would tell us quite a lot about how unstable the situation currently is in Kiev. And in the meantime, even as President Zelensky leaves Kiev to the relief of his generals, and perhaps to his own relief in terms of his need to preserve his own safety, we are now getting information that Ukraine is busy scaling down its mobilization plan. Now, the original plan was apparently to call up 500,000 men. A Ukrainian military officer, Sergei Filimonov, who is a commander of a Ukrainian battalion, says that 500,000 men is too much, it's unrealistic, it would be all but impossible to call up that many, but Ukraine could do with 250,000. Another Ukrainian expert, Pavel Narozhny, has, however, said that even 250,000 is more men than Ukraine can realistically cope with. More realistic figure would be somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000, and that Ukraine simply lacks the financial and technical resources to train and equip 500,000 men. Well, I'm not able to say what the truth behind all of this is, but I suspect that Filimonov and probably Narozhny are right, and that the mobilization plan is simply another example of grandiosity, and it's coming up against insuperable problems, and it's therefore in the process of being abandoned. Well, I'm going to round off this section of this video before I touch on just a few small things by speaking a little bit further about the situation on the rest of the battle lines. In his interview, General Syrskyi said that Ukraine is now going over to the defensive and that the Russians are attacking on every part of the front lines. Acting on the fact that Ukraine is now on the defensive, Syrskyi has made one decision, or at least appears to have made one decision, which I think is absolutely correct. He has apparently decided to withdraw the Ukrainian troops from the Krinky bridgehead. Apparently there are reports now that the Ukrainians have sent boats to Krinky, that the soldiers there are being evacuated, and that the Krinky bridgehead is being completely abandoned. In other words, the entire operation, ill-conceived operation to advance on Crimea through some kind of landing east of the Dnieper, a plan which I suspect originated with General Zelensky and might have been discussed by him with General Milley and Admiral Radikin way back in the summer. Anyway, that ill-conceived plan, it seems, has now been abandoned in its entirety. Well, we are getting more reports about fighting in other places. And I ought to say that, again, according to the Russian Defense Ministry's estimates of Ukrainian losses, the Ukrainians lost around 1,100 men yesterday, dead and wounded, across the battlefronts. And that does not include the losses that Ukraine has suffered in Avdiivka and may have suffered in that big missile strike on Selidovo, about which the Russians so far have not commented. We're getting reports that the Russians have now all but encircled the village of Pabieda, southwest of Marinka, and that they are also now very close, that they've made further advances in Novomikhailovka, which has also, by the way, been heavily bombed by the Russian Air Force. It looks as if these two villages, Pabieda and Novomikhailovka, will probably become a focus of Russian attention once Avdiivka falls. They will presumably fall soon after, at which point the main road, one of the main roads to Vuhledar, will be cut off, and the Russians are also advancing to Georgievka and the other Krasnogorovka to the north of Marinka, and that looks like they could soon be in a position to advance to Kurakhovo, another place, by the way, on these fortified line, this yellow fortified line that Simplicus the thinker has been drawing. And of course, if Kurakhovo falls after these other places have fallen, the position of Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar will become probably unsustainable. So a significant Russian advance in that direction. But the big news, apart from Avdiivka, is Bakhmut. The Russians appear to be now well inside Ivanivska. They're attacking Ivanivska from the east and from the north. So there's two prongs of the Russian advance in Ivanivska. They've captured the cemetery, the dacha areas, the Popovka forest area. There's reports that they've also captured another major fortified area held by the Ukrainians just west of Chasiv Yar itself. It looks like we are in the process of seeing a Ukrainian collapse, a collapse of Ukrainian positions to the west of Bakhmut, with the Ukrainian defenders in Klishevka and Andreevka, that area, now also very much at risk of becoming cut off, and with Chasiv Yar becoming the next town on the front lines, with the Russians preparing at some point over the next few weeks, perhaps after the spring thaw, to storm Chasov Yar as well. And we've got far less information about what's going on elsewhere on the battlefronts, but it does seem that the Russians are now well on their way to capturing the small town of Belogorovka in northern Lugansk region. This is a town, by the way, that the Russians captured before in the summer of 2022. Then the Ukrainians recaptured it during their Kharkiv counteroffensive. The Russians seem to be well on the way to recapturing it now, and we are getting reports from the Russian Defense Ministry that Ukrainian losses in this area, which is part of the Liman direction, as the Russians say, Ukrainian losses there have been exceptionally high, and that the Russians have improved their positions, which is a euphemism for saying that the Russians are advancing in the Liman area as well. And last but not least, to cap off a litany of disaster for Ukraine yesterday, we had another big Russian missile strike across Ukraine. The Ukrainians admit that they were only able to shoot down half the missiles that the Russians launched. Probably it was significantly less than that, just saying. But there were missile strikes right across Ukraine. Kiev itself was hit. Other places were hit. I'm going to discuss all of this in my next program. Now, I'm going to quickly finish by just touching on two further quick issues. Firstly, Speaker Johnson has now said very clearly that the Senate Appropriations Bill for Ukraine, Taiwan and Israel is unacceptable, and that he's not prepared to put it to a vote in the House. This is not the end of the story. There is apparently a procedural mechanism that the Democrats are thinking of using, which would override his decision and might enable this bill to be put to the House. Most commentators and reporters who I have seen think that this would be unlikely to succeed. It would require some Republicans to cross the floor and vote with the Democrats, and they doubt that this will happen. I am not so sure. I've said that legal manoeuvres of this kind, the parliamentary manoeuvres of this kind in Congress, are really beyond my understanding. So I'm not going to discuss this further. All I will say is that if Speaker Johnson prevails in his decision, then the question of further aid for Ukraine from the United States is effectively dead. And I am also going to say that an incredibly reckless series of comments by the British Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, comparing the attitude of Republicans in Congress to that of the British government in its appeasement of the Germans in 1938, I think that that has probably hardened the Republicans even further, and all that it would have done is made them extremely angry. It seems that diplomacy, the arts of diplomacy, have been lost even amongst allies. And the other is this bizarre, flesh-creeping story about how the Russians are coming up with some kind of extraordinary new weapon that they're going to put in space. It's unclear to me what exactly this weapon is supposed to be. Some suggest it's some kind of nuclear device intended to knock out American satellites. I have to say, I find this thing bizarre, and it looks to me very much like it's another part of the operation we see carried out within the United States and in the West to scare us with everything Russian. The Russians, by the way, have dismissed the story. They're saying it is malicious and untrue. Well, I may return to the last two topics in my next video. But as I said, the facts coming out of Ukraine are dramatic enough. And we will see over the next few hours and days what happens. Well, thank you for bearing with me again today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop. Get yourself all the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.